Hello, and welcome to the second part of our tissues lecture. You'll notice in the PowerPoint that I am going from that I'm going to skip over a little bit because the purpose of this lecture is teaching you tissue identification. It does not mean that you don't need to know the other material, because you do, but I feel that it's much more straightforward and that you will be able to understand the material from reading and working through your assignments. If you have problems with these particular topics, though, let me know and I'll be more than happy to address them with you. So now I would like to begin with connective tissue. We completed epithelial tissue, and just to remind you of some things about epithelial tissue, epithelial tissue has an apical surface. That's a free surface, so I want you to be familiar with the term apical. Usually when you look at epithelial tissue, you'll see lots of cells adjoining one another, and that reflects, of course, the functions of epithelial tissue. It covers and lines everything external and internal to our body, and you can find it in a single layer called simple, or several layers called stratified, and there were 3 different types: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar tissue. So make sure that you understand that and have a clear understanding of functions and identification as well as location. That's our key to learning these tissues. We want to know the functions. We want to know how to identify it, both in words and visually. And number 3, we want to know where to find those types of tissues in the body. Now let's move on to connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most widely distributed tissue type in your body, and it is a binding tissue. It does connect other types of tissues to one another. And as you'll recall, even when we were looking at the epithelial tissue, you could see connective tissue in those slides, because all epithelial tissue is going to connect to connective tissue. Remember, there's the apical surface and the basal surface, and that basal surface will connect. One last thing to remember in the identification of epithelial tissue is that we look at the apical surface to identify the type of tissue that we're looking at. So that's going to be that outer layer of cells. And we want to kind of look at the shapes of those cells and the shapes of the nuclei. Now with connective tissue, we do have 4 classes to consider. We have connective tissue proper, we have cartilage, we have bone, and then we have blood. So those are the 4 classes we'll be talking about. Now here's the major functions of connective tissue. Obviously binding, it connects. And then support, it's a supportive tissue, that's why it is the binding tissue. It is protective, it is insulating, and the last function being transportation. And the blood class is what we consider to have that major transportation function. Okay. Now, I'm sorry the recorder's a little bit over on top of the slide. Let's talk about the structural elements of connective tissue. First of all, you'll remember that with epithelial tissue, it was cell to cell to cell to cell. Well, connective tissue is not like that. You're going to see the cells much more sparsely throughout the slide when you're looking at connective tissue. You're going to see more ground substance, or what we call extracellular matrix. That is the most common element in connective tissue. And the ground substance is the medium through which solutes diffuse between blood, capillary, and cells. So things can move through this extracellular matrix. What is in the ground substance? Interstitial fluid for movement purposes. Adhesion proteins, that's glue, adhesion, sticking things together as they need to be. And proteoglycans. They trap the water in varying amounts, keeping the viscosity what it should be. Just to give you a little definition of viscosity, you can think about the oil in your car. And viscosity is kind of like the thickness or thinness of something. You know, cars have a very specific type of oil that they need, and that type of oil that you need is dependent upon viscosity. That oil has to stick to the parts in the motor, and it's temperature dependent. So the temperature, if you have a really fast hot rod car, the temperature is going to get a lot higher, and it's going to have a special type of oil so that the viscosity stays what it needs to be to keep all those parts lubricated and working. So viscosity is also super important in your body. So you can think of your body like a car in that you have to keep the viscosities what they should be to keep all those body parts lubricated as they should be. So there's some viscosity to consider in connective tissue to keep all those substances where they can move as they should and yet keep them where they should be. Now, another structural element of connective tissue that is super important to remember is that there are fibers. So fibers, when you think of connective tissue, not only are you thinking extracellular matrix, but you're also thinking fibers. And there are 3 types of fibers that you may encounter. The first type is called collagen. Now this type of fiber you will typically see running in the same direction because it is not a stretchy fiber. It is a fiber that withstands high tensile strength, provides high tensile strength. So let me give you an example of where you would see a lot of this fiber. You would see this fiber in between your vertebrae. Think about your backbone and think about the pressures and stresses that go into those pads that are in between each vertebra. Those are going to be made up of a special cartilage called fibrocartilage, and it has a lot of collagen in it to withstand that compression that occurs. So not so much as stretchiness, but more compression. So think of the phrase high tensile strength when you think about collagen. The next type of fiber is elastic. Of course, that one's a little more straightforward. Elasticy, right? You think of stretchy, and that's exactly what is going on with this fiber. They're long, thin, elasticy fibers to allow for stretch. And then the last type of fiber is called reticular. These are short, fine, highly branched collagenous fibers. These fibers, to me, remind me of Halloween. They're kind of creepy looking. That's being highly branched. It makes me think of walking through a dark street on Halloween night on one of those scary movies and all the creepy looking branchy trees. So that type of fiber is highly branched. And the reason for that is because this is the type of fiber that you find in lymphatic tissue. Lymphatic tissue is tissue of your immune system. And the reason why you have a lot of reticular fibers in lymphatic tissue is because all that branching provides a vantage point or a good hideout for those immune cells. So they camp out in these reticular fibers, and then when the bad guy comes along, they go out and attack. So these fibers are really important to our lymphatic tissue. Now let's talk about the cells that you find in connective tissue. Remember that these cells are different from looking at epithelial tissue. They're not joined next to each other. Remember, when we look at the connective tissue, you see a lot more ground substance. And then you'll see cells sparsely dispersed, typically through the matrix of the connective tissue. Now let me give you just a little bit of terminology so that you understand when you read a particular word in your book what it means. We usually name a cell ending in blast or cyte. For example, chondroblast or chondrocyte. Those are cells of cartilage. And the other thing we do is we name those cells depending on what they do. For example, in connective tissue, you're often going to see fibroblasts and fibrocytes. What do those cells do? Well, they secrete fibers. So oftentimes you can just read the cell name and know exactly where to find the cell and what it's doing. So blast is what we call a cell that's totally active and secretes. So this cell is doing what it's supposed to be doing. For example, chondroblast means that is a cell actively secreting cartilage. We'll also see an osteoblast. Osteoblasts are cells that are secreting bone, building up your bone. So blast is a cell that's making something or dividing itself. It's a very active cell. So when you see blast, you think active. When you see site, like an osteocyte, it's typically a mature cell, meaning it's sort of there doing its thing. It's where it's supposed to be. An osteocyte is going to be a cell that's in the secreted bone, and we'll see those when we look at osteons a little bit later when we move on to the skeleton. So a site is a mature cell, and a blast is an active secretory cell. And remember, those cells can be named depending on where we find them. Chondra, meaning cartilage. Fibroblast, meaning fibers. Osteo, being bone. Hematopoietic stem cells in our bone marrow and blood. Hemato makes us think of blood. Fat cells, white blood cells, mast cells, and macrophages. These are all different types of cells you'll find in different tissues. So be aware of that. Hopefully that terminology will help you understand. So here we are. This is our cartoon version of what we will find in connective tissue. What you see here is areolar connective tissue. It's a cartoon drawing of areolar. And basically we see a lot of everything. You see all three types of fibers. Actually, you see, if you're looking at a microscope slide, you're going to see be able to see the collagen really easy, and the the reticular fibers. But you'll also have capillaries. Remember, when we were dealing with epithelial tissue, it was avascular. There was not a blood supply. The nutrients and the materials that got to the epithelial tissue were through diffusion because of the nature of the tissue itself, so it didn't need the blood supply as much. But connective tissue does have a blood supply. It is vascular, except for one type, and that is going to be cartilage. Have you ever torn your cartilage? Think about it for a second. How long did it take you to recover from that? It takes a long time to recover from damage to your cartilage because there's not an immediate blood supply to heal that tissue. So that's going to be like the only connective tissue that's not going to have a good blood supply. But for the most part, connective tissues have a good blood supply. And remember, blood is a connective tissue. Another thing to note about connective tissue is all connective tissue is derived embryonically from a tissue called mesenchyme. So everything connective, or labeled connective, comes from embryonic mesenchyme tissue. Now, also in this picture, we can see the type of cells that you'll encounter, and it's a wide variety. We've got macrophages that come around and eat things that don't belong, bacteria or whatever needs to be taken care of. We've got fibroblasts to secrete fibers. Remember, blast means that cell is actively secreting fibers. We've got a lymphocyte, which is a immune cell going around policing the tissue. We have fat cells. We often find fat cells in connective tissue, and sometimes fat can be a little deceiving because you can't see the extracellular matrix because the cell is so gluttonous in fat, it takes up all the space. And one of the characteristic things of a fat cell, and remember adipose tissue is a connective tissue, is that you'll see this really fat cell and the nucleus is squished against the side of it. See how it is? And it's squished because the cell is fat. So that's typical of adipose tissue. And we also see a neutrophil, which is another white blood cell element that is involved in our immunity. Okay, now let's talk about that first class, connective tissue proper. We can categorize connective tissue proper into two categories. It's either loose or dense. So once you determine you've got connective tissue proper, you're going to either decide it's loose or dense, which is fairly easy to do because one of them looks loose and one of them looks fairly dense. To begin with, loose connective tissue is areolar tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue. Dense connective tissue is going to be dense regular and dense irregular, and it just looks that way. The pattern, one pattern's really regular and one's real irregular, and then elastic connective tissue. So let's look at loose connective tissue. This is areolar connective tissue, and this is the one where you can see all those fibers. So you can see really clearly the collagen fibers. You can also see the elastic fibers. You can't see the reticular fibers as well from this picture, but there are some there. And this is that example of that cartoon drawing we were just looking at, the areolar connective tissue. But you see lots of extracellular matrix. You see fibers. and you see sparsely distributed cells. So obviously when you look at this first thing, you're like, oh, that's definitely connective tissue. And it has several different types of cells, as we saw in the picture below. Now you can't see that you can't identify those different types of cells as well in an actual stained slide, because the nucleus is the main part that stains. If there were some white blood cells in there, we could probably see those and identify those. But for the most part, only the nucleus is being stained, so it makes it difficult to identify the actual cell. But you can see the nuclei, and typically in all of these, the nucleus, because it is a dense structure, it just stains a lot darker than the other parts. So we see fibers, we see extracellular matrix, lots of it, and we see sparsely distributed cells. Where do you find this? Most of the time, areolar connective tissue can be found under epithelial tissue. For example, let me tell you that when we look at the skin, you'll be able to see areolar connective tissue under the skin. It packages organs, is protective, and it surrounds capillaries. All right, more loose connective tissue. This is adipose. Adipose tissue, again, similar to areolar, but sparse, closely packed adipocytes because they're so fat. This is fat tissue. Those are called adipocytes. So those are cells of fat tissue. So adipose tissue, it can be just slightly deceiving, but it looks like bubbles. So you can identify it pretty easily because it looks bubbly, but the cells, remember, are so gluttonous that they push their nucleuses, or nuclei more appropriately, to the side. So look how the fat has pushed all of the nuclei to the side of the cell. Poor little nucleus has just been squished. And you see extracellular matrix in here, but the cell has become so gluttonous and fat that it takes up a lot of that extracellular matrix. So when you see this type of tissue, you're looking at bubbles and you see the extracellular matrix, just not as much. You find adipose tissue under the skin. So a lot of fat is directly just located under the skin. Around your kidneys and eyeballs, so those are protective to those organs. And then in your abdomen and breasts, so there's lots of fat tissue there. In females, also, you can find more deposits of adipose tissue in the hips as well. Next type of tissue of the loose connective type, and the last one, is reticular tissue. Remember how I told you it looks creepy? So that looks kind of creepy, right? The branching is real creepy looking. It looks like Halloween. So hopefully you'll automatically, when you see that tissue, think, oh, that's creepy, that's reticular tissue, and be able to identify it. So you see lots of extracellular matrix. The cells are kind of you have more concentration of cells in here, but still lots of extracellular matrix, which we don't see at all in epithelial tissue. And you can see those fibers. So automatically I'm seeing extracellular matrix, fibers. I know that's connective tissue. I think, oh, that's kind of creepy. That's got to be reticular tissue, which is a loose connective tissue. Typically, we find this type of tissue in our lymphatic system, so lymphoid organs. So really important to note. All right, now let's talk about the dense connective tissues. This one that you see here is called dense regular connective tissue. Now let me go ahead and tell you the one this one is commonly confused with, and that is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is somewhat similar in appearance, but what you see in skeletal muscle is you typically don't have this squiggly pattern. These are collagen fibers that you see, and they kind of have a squiggly pattern, and it is a very regular pattern, while with skeletal muscle it's a more straight pattern. So hopefully that will help you in that identification process. And the other thing you see in skeletal muscle is you'll see little striations going this way. But that is one that is commonly confused with skeletal muscle. So this is dense regular connective tissue. But you can see it's a very dense tissue. You can't really see a lot of extracellular matrix here because the fibers are so dense. They're highly concentrated fibers. So just remember that when you see that, okay, I don't see as much extracellular matrix, but I definitely see fibers. So I'm definitely at dense regular connective tissue here. The function of dense regular connective tissue is to attach muscles and bones to other muscles or bones. And it's because that's what it does, it withstands great tensile stress and strength in two opposing directions. So remember, that's collagen. Collagen does that. It's high tensile strength. What is made of dense regular connective tissue? Your tendons and your ligaments. Tendons and ligaments connect muscles and bones. So that is your dense regular connective tissue. Now let's look at the irregular version. Look at that. Somewhat similar, but look at the collagen fibers. They're real irregular. So you can see that pattern fairly easily. It's very irregular, and you will see a few elastic fibers here. And the reason why you have this irregular version is because it can take stresses in more directions. So with the dense regular, we can only take stresses in a couple of different directions. Here, we've got some different, we can withstand tension in other directions than just those couple of directions. So it makes the tissues designed to take those stresses. Where do you find this type of tissue? Oftentimes, this is the tissue that makes up fibrous capsules of organs and joints. The dermis of your skin will have some irregular connective tissue. So when we move to skin, you'll probably be able to identify some of this. And the submucosa of your digestive tract have this type of tissue. All right, last, let's talk about elastic connective tissue. Dense elastic connective tissue. So this is a regular connective tissue with high elastic fiber content. Look at that. See how all of those fibers, so they're all kind of squiggly, and look, they look stretchy. It actually reminds me of an elastic band in a pair of pants. So if you stretched it out, those fibers would stretch out. So you can see they look very elasticy. The reason for that is it allows, of course, for the recoil of the tissue following a stretch. The major location for this type of tissue is blood vessels. You'll see some in the vertebral column and the bronchial tubes of lungs because we've got some stretching here. Now this particular picture, if I had to guess, comes from your aorta. And that's usually the most common example that we use to show this tissue is in the aorta. The aorta is the major artery coming off of the heart. And one of the things about arteries is they have to have this elastic tissue and a lot of muscle because they actually pump. They have some pumping action, as even though the heart pumps as well, the arteries have some stretch and recoil to help pump blood through the system. And the aorta is a really good example because it's a really big artery. So that's typically where we get the example from. But this is elastic connective tissue. It's dense. All right, let's move to cartilage. Remember, cartilage does not have a blood supply. It's the only connective tissue that doesn't have a blood supply, and that means it kind of heals slowly. You have three types: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. The first type, hyaline cartilage, is the most abundant cartilage. So if you can't think of anything else, your guess is probably going to be best at guessing hyaline cartilage because it is the most abundant and widely distributed through the body. The cell, of course, that you find in cartilage is called a chondroblast or chondrocyte, depending on the state of the cell. And these chondroblasts produce and secrete cartilage. So the matrix of cartilage is secreted by the chondroblast. Now here's one of the things, the identifiers of cartilage. These little cells are housed in little rooms. So this is like a little room. It kind of looks like a little bubble, but it's a little protective home for that chondroblast. So lacuna is what we call that little room. And so inside the lacuna houses the little chondrocytes that are secreting matrix. So that's the way that you can identify cartilage. So you're looking for extracellular matrix, you're looking for lacuna, and then you see the little cells inside the lacuna. Now when you're dealing with hyaline cartilage, you don't see any fibers. There's no visible fibers, and that's the way that you identify the type of cartilage that it is. Hyaline cartilage is the only type of cartilage where you won't have any visible fibers. So look at that picture real good. No visible fibers. That's easy enough. It's got to be hyaline cartilage. This type of cartilage supports and reinforces, offers cushioning, and it resists compression stress. Where do you find it? Remember, it is the most abundant. Your whole entire embryonic skeleton starts out as hyaline cartilage. Ever remembered why a baby is so flexible? It's because not all of their bone has ossified. Some of it is still hyaline cartilage. So it is the pre-embryonic skeleton, or pre-human skeleton. So the embryonic skeleton is actually hyaline cartilage. You also find hyaline cartilage at the ends of long bones. So It's sort of a cushioning where bones connect. The costal cartilage of your ribs, so your rib cage actually connects to your sternum with a little cartilage, and it's hyaline. So if you think of if somebody punches you in the chest really hard, your chest can give a little bit. If it was all bone, somebody could just crush your rib cage at the sternum, right? But because there's that cartilage there, it gives just a little bit. So if you have a tough blow to the actual thorax, that's helpful. And then, of course, the cartilage of your nose is hyaline cartilage. Your trachea and larynx, all of this is hyaline cartilage. Now let's look at elastic cartilage. It's very similar looking to hyaline cartilage, except for, what do you see? Oh yes, lots of elastic fibers. So I can identify this type of cartilage because I see extracellular matrix, I see lacuna. Inside those lacuna, I see those chondrocytes. Okay, so here's our lacuna, here's a chondrocyte inside of it. And then in the extracellular matrix, I know I'm dealing with elastic cartilage because look at all the elastic. So of course that type of cartilage is stretchy. Now, the reason why it's stretchy is because it maintains shape while allowing for some flexibility. So we've got to have some give in this type of elastic cartilage. And if you want to test it out, grab your ear. So your ear is elastic cartilage. And the only other place you'll find elastic cartilage is there's this little structure called the epiglottis that actually is what keeps you from choking. When you swallow, it protects your respiratory tract so that food doesn't go down into your and choke you. Now, why oftentimes if somebody is eating and they start laughing or something, remember that's a good way to get choked. We don't laugh while we eat, and that's because it's open when we breathe. So if you go to laugh, it opens up the epiglottis, but if you go to swallow, it closes it so it gets confused and that food can actually go down into your respiratory tract and cause you to choke. So just a little note, don't laugh and eat at the same time. But those are the only two places you'll find your elastic cartilage. External ear, so go ahead and pull on it, feel of it, yep, kind of elasticy, and your epiglottis. Last type of cartilage, fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage, look at the collagen fibers. Remember I told you earlier, where do you find this? In between those pads of your vertebra. Those are your intervertebral discs. You've ever heard somebody say they slipped a disc? It's fibrocartilage. That's what pads in between the vertebra. So it's high tensile strength. You can still see the lacuna here. Okay, so we see the lacuna, and guess what's inside of them? Yes, the little chondrocytes, but we see lots of collagen fibers for high tensile strength. So its ability to withstand the compression. Where do we find these? I told you in between your vertebra, the intervertebral disc, but also the pubic symphysis. You probably don't know where that is at the moment, but you will. It's a little pad of cartilage that holds together the pelvis. And then, of course, we have little discs in our knees of fibrocartilage. Our knees take on a lot of compression and shock, so it's helpful to have that little pad of fibrocartilage there. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about bone for a moment. Bone is going to be really easy to spot if it's the compact bone, because compact bone has these little patterns called osteons, and I like to call them tree trunks. They look like tree trunks. In the middle of every osteon, you're going to have a little haversian canal that has a blood supply in it. So bone is vascular. It has a blood supply. If you break a bone or hurt a bone, it's going to heal relatively fast because it has a blood supply. And it actually has little lacuna too, but these little lacuna, and they house the little osteocytes, have little radiating lines coming out called canaliculi. So they're a little different from hyaline cartilage, and that's so that, because it's a hard matrix, so that the blood supply can actually send nutrients and things out to the external areas of the osteon. So that's basically the best identifier of bone. You see, or this is compact bone. If you see little tree trunks, you know you're dealing with the type of connective tissue known as bone. All right, and blood being the last connective tissue type, and it is, remember, the function here is transportation. You see lots of extracellular matrix. Interesting about the red blood cell, and you see lots of red blood cells, these cells do not have nuclei. So you're not going to be looking for a nucleus when you see this cell. But you see the little red blood cells, no nucleus, and that's the best identifier. They look kind of like little donuts. And then floating around in those are white blood cells. And when we cover blood in A&P2, I will teach you how to identify all of the white blood cells. That is, if you decide that you enjoyed your journey with A&P1 and you want to take A&P2 with me next semester. But the white blood cells, you can identify them by certain things about their nucleus and how they stain. And you'll find those at a ratio of about 1 to 1,000 red blood cells. So for if you're a normal, healthy individual, for every 1,000 blood cells, you'll have a white blood cell. And then again, also what you'll see these tiny little fragments that'll be floating in the blood sample. Those are platelets. And what are the functions here? Of course, transport. Transport what? Gases, nutrients, waste, any substance will be transported in the blood. And where do you find it? In your blood vessels. All right, now we're done with connective tissue. I'm going to just introduce you to nervous tissue and muscle tissue. These are the other two types of tissues that you may encounter. I really want you to concentrate on epithelial tissue and connective tissue, but we do need to touch on nervous tissue and muscle tissue. So nervous tissue, of course, is the tissue of the nervous system, and it's full of a special type of cell called neurons. And mainly what you'll find are neurons with little branches coming out, or long extensions. So these are cells that have long extensions, and that's because those extensions, called axons, make up your nerves. And that's how electrical signals transmit through your body. And so everything occurs because of the transmission of these electrical signals. And of course, you find this in your nervous system, which would be brain, spinal cord, and all the nerves that innervate your body. Now, our last thing to talk about is muscle. There are three types of muscle: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. So I'm going to try to help you decipher between those three types of muscle. First of all, let's look at skeletal muscle, which we call it the voluntary muscle. So this is the muscle that you can actually consciously innervate. And this, if you'll recall, this is the one I said that often students will confuse with that dense regular connective tissue. Remember I told you, you see the straightness of the tissue and these striations. So that will help you to identify the skeletal muscle. The other thing to note is with the striations here and this, the straightness of the muscle fibers, is that they're multinucleated. So, and they're kind of squished in between the fibers of the muscle. So you can see that. And muscle is not made of fibers. We call muscle fibers, but those are cells. Those are muscle cells. So there's no collagen, there's no reticular fibers, and there's no elastic fibers. These are cells, and it's just a common term to refer to a muscle cell as a muscle fiber, but it has nothing to do with the fibers of connective tissue. Cardiac muscle is very easy to identify. You do see those striations, but here's the thing. Here's what really helps you identify cardiac muscle. It's the branching. You see branching. You don't see branching at all in skeletal muscle. See? No branching. But here, we see the branching, and the other thing that you can see really obviously is intercalated discs. These are these structures separating each cell. So cardiac muscle has branching and intercalated discs to separate the muscle cells. And also there's only a single nucleus per cell. So where do you find cardiac muscle? Hopefully that one's pretty easy for you. In the heart. So cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. It contracts to propel blood to circulate through your entire body. And of course, you cannot control this voluntarily. It is the heart involuntarily contracts. The only way that you can manipulate it is if you go outside and run and speed it up, or go to sleep and slow it down. But it is involuntary contraction. Last type of muscle is smooth muscle. How do you identify smooth muscles? The cells are spindle-shaped. So let's look at that. So here is that spindle shape that you see, and they have a single nucleus as well. So you see a spindle-shaped cell. So that's how you identify the smooth muscle. You look for that spindle shape on the cell. They have a central nuclei. Here's the thing about this muscle. You don't have the striations. Remember, skeletal and cardiac muscle had those striations that we saw. Smooth muscle does not have this arrangement. What is the function? Smooth muscle is involuntary as well, and it propels substances through the body, through our internal passageways. So this is how the urine actually gets to the bladder. This is how the food gets through your digestive system so that you can absorb those nutrients. This is also how the uterus contracts to give birth. So smooth muscle found all throughout the hollow organs of the body. Now, I'm going to just introduce you to the epithelial membranes, the skin. The next chapter we're going to talk about is going to be the integumentary system, and we're going to talk a great deal about the skin. So that'll be the next chapter. We refer to the skin as our cutaneous membrane. So that's the external membrane, the skin. We also have other types of membranes internally. We have mucous membranes and serous membranes. So you'll read about that in your text. It is important to be able to distinguish between these types of membranes. That will conclude our lecture on tissue identification. I encourage you to listen to these lectures a couple of times because it's not really easy to identify tissues. It's something that you have to practice at. I've practiced a lot so that I would be able to give you the correct information and the information that would help you to be able to identify these tissues. So I recommend you listening to this again and really concentrating on the elements of those tissues that I'm talking about that I feel will help you to be able to identify those tissues. Just to give you a little, maybe a little set of directions on how to approach it. So let's give you an approach. When you look at a slide, first thing I would like for you to do is to just designate what type of tissue of the four. Am I looking at epithelial tissue? Am I looking at connective tissue? Am I looking at muscle or nervous tissue? So just think about that. You want to go ahead and categorize it. Now, tissue, when you look at the tissue, it's like a landscape, okay? For example, I can get an idea of whether I'm in Africa or whether I'm in Antarctica by looking at the landscape. But there's probably going to be some common elements, right? Maybe not so much in Antarctica, but I can basically get an idea. I'm looking at trees. I'm looking at the ground, I'm looking at the sky. Those are going to be indications of where I am looking at a landscape. So look at the tissue the same way. What do you see in the landscape? You see cells? How are the cells arranged? If they're abutted next to each other, or is there extracellular matrix? So that's going to help you to identify, am I looking at epithelial tissue? Am I looking at connective tissue? Then notice, hey, are there fibers? Is the tissue really tightly packed, or is it more loose? So asking yourself those questions will help you identify those tissues going in the direction of epithelial tissue and connective tissue. And of course, muscle and nervous tissue, you've got to think about some other things like striations and directions of fibers and cell shape to determine those two. But if you categorize it to epithelial tissue or connective tissue and then look at how the cells are arranged, then, if you say, hey, this is definitely epithelial tissue, well then look, is it one layer or is it several layers? Does it have a free surface and a basal surface? That will help you to categorize it, and then look at the shapes of those cells and the nuclei. If you decide it's connective tissue, look at the extracellular matrix. What's in it? Are there fibers? Are there different types of fibers? Remember, collagen fibers are thick, elastic fibers are thinner, and then your reticular fibers look creepy, they're branchy. So hopefully that'll give you some pointers in identifying those slides. Please remember to call on me if you have any issues or need some more help. Have a great day. Thank you.